Hello and welcome to Newswire. I am Jawad Tehami. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has met many heads of the states and the governments and high-ranking officials on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. The most important of all the meetings was with the US President Donald Trump, in which PM Khan said that the US has the responsibility to resolve conflicts as the most powerful country in the world. President Trump has renewed his mediation offer between Pakistan and India for resolving the Kashmir dispute. President Trump also said that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has given very aggressive statements during his address to the Indian Americans in Houston. On the other side, the situation in Kashmir is worsening as the curfew and the complete communication blackout has entered its 51st day. On the other hand, Indian Army Chief Bipin Rawat continues to hurl accusation on Pakistan and give provocative statements. Pakistan's Foreign Office and spokesman for the Pakistan Armed Forces have refuted Indian commander's accusations, terming those irresponsible. Director General Inter-Services Public Relations Major General Asif Ghafoor has said accusations of infiltration, presence of alleged terrorist camps are a pretext for a false flag operation, an attempt to divert world's attention from Indian state terrorism and siege in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. To talk more about this, we have been joined by Mr. Shayan Ahmad, Research Associate at the Research Society of International Law in our Islamabad studios, Dr. Farhan Chak, Associate Professor of International Affairs at Qatar University from Doha, Ms. Zainab Ramahi, the decolonial activist from Delaware, and Mr. Tariq Zameer, former ambassador, joining us from Islamabad. Thank you all for being part of the Newswire today. Sir, I will start the discussion with Mr. Tariq Zameer. How do you see this meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Imran Khan? What positive things do you think Pakistan has taken out of it?
You see, the meeting, as Mr. Trump said that the Indian Prime Minister had made an aggressive statement. So that's a positive outcome, I must say. Beyond that, if you look at the statement issued by the State Department, it speaks of the two countries, to tone down and to bring normalcy. Unfortunately, that statement doesn't speak about the worsening human rights situation in Kashmir. If it had been mentioned there, then I would have been happier that, that is the official position. So I won't read too much into this until, we see some pressure from the United States on India to improve the human rights situation in Jammu and Kashmir.
Okay, Dr. Farhan, I'll come to you. How do you see President Trump's statement when he says he is to mediate? This offer is not new. There hasn't been any practical measures on the part of the US so far. So it's the renewal of that particular statement which he had already given of his mediation offer between Pakistan and India.
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to look at it in a little bit different way. I believe by President Trump constantly mentioning this, it's a win. And you have to put this in the context. India has been petrified at anyone even mentioning the name Kashmir. Even saying Kashmir terrifies Indians. And if you look at the past 51 days, what's happened since their illegal and unilateral abrogation of what was essentially a false and fictitious ascension anyway, they are absolutely petrified at this constant mentioning of Kashmir, its disputed status. And by Trump, even though he knows all this, the Indian lobbyists are constantly mentioning, it's between us, we'll deal with it, don't mention it, but he keeps mentioning it. I believe that this is also a little stick to India, that we're going to keep bringing this up. So on that level, it is a win. Of course, it's not enough, and there are a lot of things that need to happen, but nonetheless, it's maintaining a strong presence in the international media, and by President Trump talking about it the way he is, even though it's not going to do anything substantive on the ground, it is ultimately, for the time being, a psychological war. And in this sense, Pakistan is on top.
Okay, Dr. Farhan, I'll come back to you when he says that on one day, President Trump said that India hasn't got any best friend other than him in the White House. And the very next day, when he meets the Prime Minister of Pakistan, he says that Pakistan hasn't been seen as such as he sees Pakistan. So there is a bit of confidence on the American side. Don't you think both of these statements contradictory within themselves? Ms. Zainab, what do you have to say about it?
I think, I mean, honestly, that so much faith in somebody like President Trump is misguided, similar to some of the efforts that have already been made and the faith that has been placed in international organizations like the United Nations. Unfortunately, Trump and Modi and others, including Netanyahu, for example, share fundamentally supremacist ideologies, I think, as their ultimate unifying characteristic, For Modi, it's Hindutva. For Trump, it is white nationalism, as has been oft discussed. So I really don't believe that Trump has a serious commitment to improving or helping to improve the situation with regards to human rights for Kashmiris. I think it's also when we look to states that have their own colonial histories in order to support indigenous populations facing military occupation, colonization, and repression. I think that we're fundamentally misguided in doing that. At the same time, Modi speaks the language of power, and there is something that must be done in order to get him at least to feel, yes, that the world's eyes are on Kashmir and that he cannot just get away with anything.
Ms. Zainab, the point well taken. I'll come back to you. Mr. Zameer, what is the difficulty for the US president to adopt more of a harder stance, just the way he has followed an angry rhetoric in the case of both Iran and Afghanistan?
2 or 3 points. One, India, because of its size and big market, and then a big Indian diaspora in the United States. And then traditionally, it is heard in the Western capitals. I think because U.S. president is such a busy head of state, he probably doesn't have had enough time to go into the details of the Kashmir dispute, Unless he has that, and then offering mediation is one thing, but then mediation is between the two parties and both have to agree to that. And, so I would say that unless we hear something in the written statement by the State Department or the White House, these are, positive signs. He's saying that it's aggressive, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, it may be aimed at, getting more concessions from India, for instance, in trade, etc. So you have to keep that in mind, because Mr. Trump is a very, very intelligent and a smart man, and he's a businessman, so he knows how to extract, maximum benefits from others. Therefore, I would not like to, put too much trust in these verbal statements. They have to come, the proper statements from the State Department and the White House, those that you can always refer back to in your negotiation with the U.S. and say, look, this is the statement that you made, and now that was your commitment, and now deliver on it. So far, we don't have that. But I would, at the same time, not like to reject it out of hand altogether. But these days, there are so many heads of state in New York, and everybody is meeting everybody. For instance, the Prime Minister had a good interaction with the Chinese Foreign Minister today, and the Chinese Foreign Minister showed him the sport. And then he had a good interaction with the Turkish Mr. Tayyip Recep Erdogan. So those are positive statements.
But Mr. Zameer, not every head of the state or the government gets to meet the United States president. And when it comes to meeting with the Pakistani Prime Minister, he himself offered the mediation in the last meeting when Prime Minister went into the US to meet the US president. So there is an interest of the US as far as Pakistan is concerned. And when we talk about the Afghan conflict. So, do you think that Pakistan can actually use that particular card in order to impress upon the US to use its good offices to make India to come to the negotiating table?
As I said, that let's not reject it out of hand. But at the same time, I also say, let's not pin all our hopes on that. Because if it is a serious offer of mediation, then it should be, followed up by some concrete steps. And number one amongst them is at least have this human rights situation improved in Jammu and Kashmir. It's over 50 days now that these poor 8 million Kashmiris are in the largest concentration camp in the human history. And there is no improvement. I mean, I would say that he's a very tricky guy, this Mr. Modi. He goes to the United States and he uses all this kind of weird language about Pakistan, and he doesn't speak a word about Kashmir. What kind of people they are? I mean, they have no sense that, unfortunately, these Kashmiris are stuck in a sort of between.
The Kashmiris are stuck. Mr. Tariq, I'll come back to you. Dr. Khan, how do you think what the U.S. should do? Renewing the mediation offer time and again is not going to solve the problem. Perhaps somebody has to push India to come to the negotiating table. What exactly the measures do you think that the U.S. can adopt at the moment, or the UN can adopt at the moment, to make at least India come to the negotiating table in order to talk about the Kashmir dispute?
Well, I think first of all, Pakistan Kashmiris have to continue to highlight what is happening through op-eds, through articles, through books, through seminars, through these protests that are happening throughout the world. And what is very different about this time around is that indigenous Kashmiris themselves from the valley are at the forefront of the fight. And that India has not really seen in the manner it's done today before. So that adds a whole new dynamic. You see, India wants to trap this in many ways. It wants to trap it in a bilateral discussion, which will amount to nothing. So Pakistan should come out right away and say there is no bilateral dealing with Kashmir, because Kashmir also involves the Kashmiris. So how
Dr.
can it
Farhan,
be bilateral?
what we have seen over the last couple of months, that Pakistanis had been supporting Kashmiris after the subjugation after the 5th of August, and they had been consistently raising this issue on every international fora. What I want to understand at the moment is, after the renewal of the mediation offer, time and again, the US, and on the other hand, we have seen that the presidential hopeful Bernie Sanders have also criticized President Trump's participation in the Houston rally of Modi. So what exactly those practical measures can US take to make India come to the negotiating table? Only offering the mediation is not going to solve the problems, of course.
No, you see, look, from the motivation of the Americans to constantly, or President Trump for that matter, to constantly mention it, is not in the benefit of human rights, or even for that matter, let's be honest, I'm sure that he probably wouldn't even care. It is a tool of leverage that he can use against India to extract more benefits. So this is the cold, realpolitik reality on how statesmen usually act according to their interests and according to how they can pressurize their friends and enemies, to be honest, both, and then extract benefit. So I believe part of President Trump's constant mentioning it is to kind of extract or potentially extract these benefits from India. But that nonetheless doesn't change how Kashmiris or Pakistan should react. We also need to recognize, whatever the motivation, that we should continue to accept his offer, and also then show the world that, look, it's India that is refusing any type of discussion, whether it's third-party mediation.
Of course, it's India that is refusing. Pakistan had all offering to enter into dialogue with India on all the outstanding issues between both of these countries, but it was India which was reluctant. Mr. Tariq, what do you see? How can this reluctance, why is that India is shying away from entering into the negotiations with Pakistan on all the disputed issues, particularly when Pakistani government is very much ready, and as soon as a Prime Minister of Pakistan took reign of the power, he offered talks with India?
You see, Indians, they have shown this belligerence for the last at least 5 years. It's nothing new. They think that by doing this, they can make Pakistan buckle under, or sort of, come under their pressure and talk to them on their terms, which we will never do. We have our stand on all these issues, on Kashmir, on various things. We are a sovereign nation, and we are a strong nation. In terms of size, maybe we are smaller than India, but otherwise in determination, in our pride in being Pakistanis. We are a strong nation. So they just want to break your will, by not talking to you. This is a terrible situation from international relations point of view. A country as big as India, as they are becoming more prosperous, they are becoming even more belligerent, and they are absolutely.
India, despite becoming more prosperous, becoming more belligerent, and we will talk about the provocative and belligerent posturing by the Indian Army Chief. I'll go to Ms. Zainab. How do you see these statements coming from the Army Chief of India regarding the terrorist hideouts that he accuses Pakistan with?
Of course, terrorism, right, is a frame that India has long used vis-a-vis Kashmir to justify its military presence, to justify the ongoing violations of human rights, and just the way that, in spite of its rhetoric in claiming that Kashmir is an integral part of the Indian Union and that Kashmiris should be looking forward to becoming Indians like all other Indians, it has always subjected Kashmiris to a different standard when it comes to human rights, political rights, civil and economic rights. And so the frame of terrorism is another one that is, motivated by Islamophobia that we see globally to justify acts of violence against the Kashmiri population. And I think that they're doing the same thing yet again.
Okay, Mr. Shayan, what do you have to say of belligerent statement coming from the Army Chief of India, and he's accusing Pakistan of having the terrorist hideouts, which has been refuted by the Pakistan's Foreign Office and likewise by the spokesperson of the Pakistan Armed Forces, Director General Inter Services Public Relations, Major General Asif Ghafoor?
So in terms of these allegations, I think this even occurred in, for example, the February incidents of Balakot. So they, at that time, asserted that there was an imminent threat of the sort that India would be attacked. So essentially what international entails in this respect is that these assessments must be made objectively. And what I mean by objectivity is that a state functionary should be responsible in the statements that he is making. And by that, I refer to the fact that there should be concrete evidence which needs to be brought forward in order for these statements to be even entertained. And it is primarily because of that these statements, when taken to, for example, the international community, they will not hold merit because these are not substantiated by anything else. And even Prime Minister Imran Khan time and again has referred that a false flag operation might be carried out in order to substantiate what the Army Chief is saying at present. So I think the prior warnings and there being a lack of evidence falls in favor of Pakistan, and until for such time that there is no conclusive evidence, I don't think they have anything to go on with.
So that implies that the fears and the warnings which have been raised by Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan are turning out to be true by such provocative statements by the top brass at the policy level in India. Ms. Zainab, when we talk about this nefarious design, do you think it is actually directed to change the larger Muslim majority into a minority in India on occupied Kashmir?
There's no doubt about it. BJP, RSS, and their affiliates understand Hindu civilization to be their national project, and I think Modi's, intending on making the unification, quote unquote, of India with Kashmir as his legacy, regardless of what other, acts he's doing for the future success of India. And we can analogize this, of course, to other ethno-nationalist rhetoric, like Zionist rhetoric, mythologizing a Judea and Samaria without regard to the indigenous people who are living there. So absolutely, this is one step along a very clear path towards settler colonization of the region. So far, that has not been the situation, and Indian nationals have not been permitted to, hold land in Kashmir. Of course, we've always had the, over 700,000 military occupiers who have occupied considerable amounts of land physically in the Kashmir Valley and surrounding areas. But this opens the door for a completely new relationship. with India, and is certainly an attempt to change the demography of the region, to quell resistance there for once and for all, and to quote unquote solve the Kashmir issue in accord with the designs of the BJP, which is really to establish a Hindu civilization in India. We need to look no further than the recent stripping of almost 2 million Indian Muslims in Assam of their citizenship, again to understand the way in which India is meant to be a nation for Hindus first and foremost, and certainly not for those who identify either as Muslim, but particularly Kashmiri Muslim, which remains a threat, a perceived threat to that sort of Hindu nationalization, concept of national citizenship.
Ms. Zainab, most recently we have seen after the Crimean issue, when Russia annexed Crimea forcefully, there was a lot of international pressure, and the relations of Russia with the European powers and the US deteriorated, and there happened to be the sanctions which were imposed on Russia. In this case, when India has annexed Indian-occupied Kashmir, is there any sort of possibility of sanctions the international community can impose on India to impress upon it to stop its human rights violations in occupied valley?
As I said earlier, Modi and other world powers as well, they speak the language of power, right, and not human rights, as one of your guests, I think, rightly pointed out. Whether we want to consider this realpolitik or anything else, it is just the way that the world works. And I think that is exactly what must happen. I don't see much appetite for that to happen, but I absolutely believe that very serious economic sanctions need to be placed on India in order to force it to comply with international law norms of human rights in the area, and to allow this dispute to be resolved in the forum that it is supposed to be resolved in, which is at the UN, which is subject to the will and the self-determination of the Kashmiri people. So indeed, I think this not only should happen, but it must happen, and yet at the same time, I don't see much appetite for that right now in the international community.
Dr. Farhan, how do you see this statement by a Pakistan Armed Forces spokesman, Major General Asif Ghafoor, when he says any misadventure by India, or India is trying to create a scenario for false flag operation to divert the world's attention, and any misadventure by India would definitely be responded befittingly?
Well, I think the comment it's right on. They should make these comments to kind of highlight the fact that India is trying to rattle Pakistan. I think you have to remember this too, that a lot of the words, I wouldn't take them so serious. Do they actually think that they can cross the border and try to physically retake Azad Kashmir? They'd be out of their mind. They know there is no way that they would not even hold it, the people would revolt. So these are messages that I take with a grain of salt. These are meant to rattle Pakistan. Pakistan should not be rattled by them. They should come forward and say this is pretext for a false flag, which is right, to kind of undercut the potential of that. But it would be for India absolutely suicidal if they ever tried any adventurism. I think they learned their lesson last time. And so, again, it would be to Pakistan's advantage if they were to do something that foolish. But I can't keep anything past them. To be honest, they've done so many ridiculous things that have shot themselves in the foot, the Indian establishment I'm referring to, that I would not keep it past them to attack Pakistan. But that would be a huge mistake on their part, and they'll find out.
It will be a huge mistake on the part of India if it goes into any misadventure against Pakistan. It should learn lessons from the previous time as its jets entered into Pakistani airspace, and one was downed inside Pakistani territory and the other one in the Indian territory. And as a goodwill gesture, Pakistan released the captured Indian pilot. Dr. Farhan, how do you think, earlier we have seen a statement by the European Union MPs that they have raised concern and have also called for trade and travel sanctions against India. Do you think these can be implemented and can be imposed on India in coming months?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think as time goes on and the situation gets drawn out again and again, and more people are going to be aware, they're going to start. They're not going to once the curfew is even slightly let go, there's going to be an eruption. And then there's going to be a reaction to that, and there's going to be violence.
This is inevitable. There is no walking back from what they have done. There is unfortunately going to be violence in the forthcoming months, and it could go to extreme violence. And as that happens, the European Union will increasingly kind of absorb a more harsher rhetoric against India, and sanctions are very likely. We have to continue the pressure. We have to continue the media campaign, the opinion pieces, the forums all over the world to highlight that this is not a bilateral issue. Simla agreement is dead. And the Indian kind of attempts at talking about attacking Azad Kashmir, and this is actually also working to their disadvantage. They're looking like bullies.
To their disadvantage.
President Trump called out
these brilliant statements, and also when they talk about the bilateral agreements, they have done this move unilaterally, and the similar accord remains dead after this unilateral move. Mr. Shayan, I'll come to you to take your last word. How do you think the international community can impress upon India? What could be the last resort at their hands to make India come to the negotiating table?
So in terms of, I'll start with the Shimla agreement first. So in terms of the fact that India thinks that this is a bilateral issue, that emanated from Shimla agreement and then a subsequent Security Council resolution which adopted wording on the same line. So in my opinion, when India took a unilateral action, it then took a material breach of the Shimla agreement. And in turn, when there is a material breach of a particular treaty, it means that the treaty may now be set aside. So because a treaty has been set aside, it then reverts us back to the prior resolution. So the one basis on which India continued to assert their bilateralism has, or could for the sake of argument, be said to have taken aside. Now, as for the Crimean situation, so the European Union in particular imposed sanctions in Crimea, and those sanctions of the nature have been highlighted, and there were attempts on the occupied Palestinian authorities as well so as to impose sanctions through the EU. So these sanctions will only be imposed once we have definitively established that, okay, one, there is an occupation, two, subsequent to the occupation, an annexation has occurred, because we've seen in the Crimean region that Russia has attempted or has annexed the region. So it is then when these violations trigger. So I think on a perhaps a lesser scale from one Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the other, there needs to be serious legal discussion on the situation being classified under international law.
There needs to be a serious discussion on part of the Foreign Office, and this issue must be taken up seriously by the international community, particularly the US, the European Union, and the United Nations, and they must play their role in order to impress upon India to come to the negotiating table and lift the curfew that has entered into 51st day today. Thank you very much, Mr. Shayan Ahmad, Research Associate at the Research Society of International Law, joining us from Islamabad studios. Ms. Zainab Ramahi, decolonial activist, joining us from Delaware, and Dr. Farhan, analyst, who is Associate Professor of International Affairs at the Qatar University, joining us from Doha, and Mr. Tariq Zameer, a former ambassador, joining us from Islamabad. Here we take a short break, and when we come back, we'll discuss Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan's emphasis on dialogue and the future of the peace process in Afghanistan. Stay with us. We'll be back in a bit. Welcome back to Newswire. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has said that there is no military solution to the Afghan conflict. He has also said that Pakistan's decision to join the US-led war on terror was the biggest mistake in history. His statement comes after 40 civilians were killed at a wedding party during a raid conducted by Afghan special forces on a Taliban hideout yesterday. The majority of the dead were women and children. Earlier, a UN report claimed that Afghan and allied international forces have killed more civilians than the insurgents during this year. The peace talks between the US and the Taliban had ended after 9 rounds of talks after President Trump called them off abruptly. Taliban then visited Moscow and Tehran to brief the respective countries about the progress of peace talks. Afghan presidential elections are also around the corner. To understand the dynamics of the Afghan conflict and the prospects of the peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan, we are joined by Dr. Jonathan Schroden, analyst from Florida, and Mr. Ahmad Murid, former representative of the U.S. Central Command, also joining us from Florida. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time for the show. I will start the discussion with you, Dr. Jonathan. How do you see Prime Minister Imran Khan's statement, especially at a time when the peace talks between the Taliban and the U.S. are stalled?
Well, it's a strong statement, and clearly one that reflects, I think, a sentiment that exists inside of Pakistan, which is that the Pakistanis have paid a heavy price, both in terms of their own military casualties, their own civilian casualties inside of Pakistan, for, in their view, joining the U.S.'s war on terror. I think that's a debatable point as to whether or not, those prices would have been paid, in any case. I mean, it's clear that Pakistan has had over the last 10, 15, 20 years problems with militants in, some of the spaces, especially along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Whether or not they would have had those same problems, had the U.S. invaded Afghanistan or not is certainly a debatable point. But the fact remains that there are a lot of people in those spaces that have caused problems for the Pakistani state. And so I think, my view is they probably would have had a lot of those problems whether they had joined the U.S. Explicitly or not.
Okay, Mr. Ahmad, what role do you think Pakistan can play at this point in time to help the warring parties in Afghanistan come to the negotiating table? Pakistan has already facilitated these peace talks, then they ended abruptly.
I think Pakistan's role has always been very crucial. Pakistan remains a very important neighbor to Afghanistan. And more importantly, the Taliban leadership, their strategic leadership are currently based in the government and the military right now also concur to that. So given that, Pakistan still has a very important role to play in the Afghan peace and reconciliation program. At least to tell the Taliban or persuade the Taliban to enter the Afghan government, with the Afghan government into a negotiation. So for this reason, Pakistan's role is important.
Okay, Pakistan has already facilitated, and yesterday Prime Minister Imran Khan also emphasized on negotiations and dialogue for lasting peace in Afghanistan. How do you think it can be achieved? There had been 9 rounds of talks between the two warring parties, the US and the Taliban, and abruptly it was called off by President Trump owing to one fatality of an American soldier due to Taliban attack.
I think, as you mentioned, yes, Pakistan has been facilitating these talks during the last 9 months, and the U.S. sides also acknowledged that. But with President Trump's cancellation of the peace talks, unfortunately, right now the prospect for Afghan peace and reconciliation remains murky at this point. And now we have the election, which is around the corner, coming very soon. But in the final analysis, there is no military solution, which I agree, to the Afghan conflict. There needs to be a political solution between the Afghan government and the Taliban. It's time for the Taliban to join the Afghan government after resolving their issues with the American side. And to talk about a political system that is acceptable for both sides in the future.
Mr. Ahmad, you want the Taliban to come back to the negotiation table and join and recognize the legitimacy of the Afghan government over there. Dr. Jonathan, what impact do you think? Already you have described in detail the kind of price Pakistan had to pay regarding bringing peace into Afghanistan in terms of over $100 billion lost to economy and over 70,000 people losing their lives in this war on terror. What impact do you think the failure in these recently stalled talks between the US and Taliban is having on Pakistan right now?
Well, I'm not sure it changes all that much inside of Pakistan, to be honest with you. I mean, Pakistan's been dealing with the Afghan war for really close to 40 years. in addition to the 18 years that the U.S. has been there. So I'm not sure the failure of the talks changes much inside of Pakistan, really, because that was the status quo, status quo ante. Looking forward, though, I mean, the U.S. will, I think, at some point want to get the talks restarted. It will probably want to do so under a different set of conditions than it left off. Given that President Trump canceled the talks due to his dissatisfaction with the terms of the deal. And so at some point, I think they're going to want to come back to the table with the Taliban. When that will happen is really a question of some debate. Certainly not before the Afghan presidential elections this week. The targeting, the announced targeting of the leader of Al-Qaeda's affiliate in the Indian subcontinent in southern Afghanistan yesterday, who was apparently co-located with a number of local Taliban leaders, will certainly cause the U.S. to take a pause on some of the terms of the deal, especially those that were pertaining to the Taliban's supposed guarantees to cut ties with terrorist groups with international ambitions. So I think the U.S., at some point will come back to the table. When that happens, I don't know. But when it does, it will come back with a, probably more maximal set of demands. And I would expect that it'll look for Pakistan's help in trying to get the Taliban to accede to those demands, or at least come back to the table to discuss them.
You've just said that you look at the U.S. coming back to the negotiating table, but you're not sure of exact time when it is going to come back to the negotiating table. So most probably you said that it is going to happen after the Afghan presidential election, but there has been an increase of attacks from both the sides, from the Afghan forces and the Taliban. What effect do you think these attacks are going to have on the upcoming Afghan elections?
Well, I think the elections are really down to incumbent President Ghani and the CEO Abdullah at this point. Those are really the only two viable candidates, I think. And most people, I think that Ghani's probably going to win, although perhaps not in a first round vote. It's very hard to tell because the expectations are that the voter turnout is going to be considerably lower than the 2014 presidential election, and potentially even lower than the most recent parliamentary elections that they had. So it's a little bit hard to discern the outcome at this point. But I would say if it goes to a second round, and if the elections are messy, which would be effectively a repeat of what happened in 2014, that would be very bad both for stability and political transition inside of Afghanistan. But it would also deal a real blow to the Afghanistan peace talks as well, because the U.S., I think, will be very unhappy and dissatisfied with that type of outcome. And it will also deal a real blow to the mandate of the Afghan government to eventually sit down and talk with the Taliban directly.
Mr. Ahmed, presidential elections over there in Afghanistan have already been delayed twice. Do you see this could happen this time around after the intensity and the frequency of the attacks have increased from both sides, and they are also resulting into the civilian casualties?
I think the elections will be happening as it's scheduled on 28th, and the Afghan security forces have taken their measurements. They have announced recently and before that they are ready for the elections. All preparations have been made by them. And Afghanistan cannot afford another, as Dr. Jonathan mentioned, another election fiasco. Hopefully this will give the Afghan future state some legitimacy and mandate to start talks with the Taliban on behalf of a strong, centralized government at this time. Because in 2014, there were a lot of challenges. You had a weak and divided government, which came as a result of those elections that sort of hampered peace talks during the last 5 years. So hopefully this time, with the election taking place, although there will be some violent, of course, violence by the Taliban and some other groups, but nevertheless, the elections will be happening, and this will empower the Afghan future government and people to enter the talks from a position of strength, I believe, with the Taliban in the future.
Dr. Schroden, we have seen a lot of civilians losing their lives in these attacks from both the Afghan forces as well as the Taliban. But a recent UN report has claimed that the civilian casualties as a result of the Afghan forces, international forces attacks had been more than that of the attacks by the insurgents. Does it depict that there hasn't been any precision in these attacks by the international forces?
Well, I think it's a little bit misleading to cite only that part of the UNAMA report. I mean, a lot of people do make a point of that statistic, but if you look at the total number of civilians killed and those wounded, it's about It's about a similar, split between what the Taliban have caused and what U.S. and Afghan forces have caused as in the past, which is to say the Taliban are causing more civilian casualties overall. But the point remains that it has been, especially in the weeks since Trump, tweeted and called off the peace negotiations, it has been an especially bloody, week or two since then. I mean, last week alone, there were something like 360 civilians killed and wounded in Afghanistan, by all sides, when the previous average for the first 6 months of this year was about 150 per week. So we're at double the average over the last week, which is, I think, high. It's emblematic of how both sides have really ramped up the violence in the wake of the call off of the peace negotiations, which is perhaps not surprising.
I'll quickly add over here, these are the new figures which have been released by Ministry of Public Health that show that the conflict-related violence in past 12 months, which relates from September the 16th to 2018, of September 10 to 2019, the figures are that more than 3,300 civilians were dead and over 14,600 others were wounded. These are the official facts which have been given by the Ministry of Public Health in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and the numbers are very large, right? I mean, there's no question that the civilians in Afghanistan are paying a heavy price at being at the intersection of what's happening here. It's really unfortunate that the war at this point has moved away from what you could consider an counterinsurgency battle in which, the counterinsurgents would be trying to protect the population from the insurgents, to really more of a direct attrition style of warfare, where the U.S. is trying and its Afghan partners are trying to inflict maximum damage on the Taliban, and the Taliban are trying to inflict maximum damage against Afghan security forces, both as means of trying to gain leverage in these talks. And of course, the civilians are caught in the middle of that, which is really a tragic situation.
The civilians have been caught in the middle war, which is between, of course, the international forces led by the U.S. and the Taliban. Thank you for joining in. Dr. Jonathan Schroden, an analyst joining us from Florida, and Mr. Ahmed Murid Partaw, former representative of the U.S. Central Command, also joining us from Florida. That's all for now, and we'll be seeing you tomorrow with an in-depth analysis of the latest happenings from around the globe. Till then, it's goodbye.